morning. Listen, I hope you enjoyed the first session. Just in the interest of keeping things going at a pace, we're a little bit behind, but we'll finish the session by 1 o'clock for about a lunch. We have 4 panelists, 15 minutes each, and we'll take them in the order on the schedule, and we'll begin with Roland talking about logistical nationalism.
My name is Roland Gjoni. I'm a third-year PhD student at the School of Politics, and after the 2 keynote speakers, I hope you don't find it totally trivial, because my study is based on an empirical field work that I did for my PhD thesis, and the broader project focuses on the dilemmas of kin states, comparing Albania and Ireland after the partition of Albania and Ireland, and this is one that focuses specifically on the post-communist kin politics of Albania. So what I'm planning to do is, first I'll do an introduction of the concept, then what I did during the field work and what I found out as Albania as a kin state in 2 ethno-national conflicts involving Albanians in Kosovo and Macedonia. First, the intervention of a state into ethno-nationalist conflicts involving perceived co-ethnics, those who the state or elites of the state assume to share national ties on the basis of ethnic affinity or similarity, is defined as a kin state intervention, and there is a limited but growing field of work in this area that speaks to 3 different literature. One is nationalism, second is international relations, and more specifically international security. And some of the kind of more notable scholars are mentioned. King and Melvin had an article in '99 that defined some of the kind of traits or behaviors of kin states. And kin states in the literature are found to be essential for the escalation of ethno-national conflicts. We have books and articles from different scholars. One of the famous ones that kind of found this concept of ethnic affinity used for foreign policy issues and nationalist movements was Roger Brubaker, which in his book in 1996 found it as a potentially explosive field of conflicts when a kin state, a kin minority or an external minority located in another state, and the state which hosted in a kind of relational field can get engaged into conflicts. Therefore, he said that these 3 fields have all their own concerns, their own nationalist politics, and are actors in the field. So, and interventionist actions of a state towards external kin groups outside may range from most aggressive, irredentism, aggression, temporary military intervention. For example, you may categorize Russian intervention in Georgia as a similar case, or in the case of irredentism, some of the examples mentioned are Croatian and Serbian dueling irredentisms when the dissolution of Yugoslavia was happening. But there are also other less drastic forms of support that states have designed to help communities sharing ethnic ties outside borders, that are cultural support, material support, and diplomatic support and so on. But there are also theoretically exclusionary states that kind of are inactive, are passive, and don't so much get involved in this case. This is more kind of theoretical assumption, because no matter who are the statesmen of the day, there are hardly any members of elites who do not diplomatically or in some kind of indignation show some kind of concern about the fate of, let's say, Irish or Albanian or other people who are assumed to be co-nationals outside. So Albania as a kin state is categorized as in a gray zone, including countries which have a strong interest in Albanians outside borders, and most of Albanians live in Kosovo and Macedonia, but also in smaller now groups in Serbia and Montenegro. And in general, it has shown a very cautious restraint in terms of policies, but very kind of interested in terms of rhetoric. So, for example, the high mark, or the peak of Albanians' rhetorical support was the decline to sign Helsinki Accord in 1975 for good neighborly relations and resolution of conflict with peaceful means, using as a justification, among other things, except that they criticized the whole concept of security and cooperation and collective security as a imperialistic and so on, because it was communist Albania. But in 1975, one of the three reasons mentioned is because signing peaceful resolution of conflicts as a kind of building principle of Helsinki would limit its role as a kin state for Albanians in Yugoslavia, to help them with their policies and so on. But overall, in terms of practice, Albania was non-interventionist during the Cold War, although Albanians in Yugoslavia went through different kinds of discrimination, state-based, massive expulsion to Turkey for a period, for example, 1948, 1968, and so on. So the plight of the kin was not so much reflecting policies, but so much more in the rhetoric. So my research question is then focused more in the post-communist period, and it looks at how Albania behaved in the two conflicts that emerged, first in 98-99, and then 2001 first in Kosovo and then in 2001 in Macedonia. So the cutoff point is 2001. And my puzzle was that I started to look at different typologies of kin intervention, and I could see that most authors were pointing to three key factors that, or set of factors that affect the kin state's policies. One was ethnic affinity, the idea that this ethnic affiliation matters for most states, and they do something when their co-ethnics are in danger. Second was that there is no such thing as ethnic affinity, is instrumental, elite-driven domestic competition that kind of make leaders trump up the nationalist card, but otherwise they don't intervene. And the cases of, for example, Hitler in Sudetenland or a more recent Russian intervention are used as non-nationalist goal pursued through the disguise of nationalist ideas. Whereas in the case of Albania, what I could not see, what puzzled me was that first there was the rhetoric was not was supportive but no intervention, and then in the two cases that that Albanians were involved in ethno-nationalist conflict, in one they indirectly supported the Kosovo Liberation Army, and in the other one they de-escalated the conflict by isolating the National Liberation Army of Albanians in Macedonia and worked with NATO to end the conflict. So I wanted to find first, why is irredentism totally disregarded or ruled out from Albanian elites, and why in two different types of conflicts that involve Albanians, there was even over time a kind of moderation and difference in behavior. That kind of suggested to me that there is, of course, there's maybe some ethnic affinity, but this is fluid over time, and there are all other reasons for showing this variation. So I looked, as I mentioned, the domestic factors and external constraint, and I set out to do an elite-based field research based on this idea that it's elite competition what drives the intervention of the state. And I had an interview sample of, so far it's 78. I finished the field work, but there are here and there a few interviews that I may do over the summer. And there are semi-structured interviews and secondary sources. So I met statesmen, political actors, guerrilla leaders, and civil society, including 4 former presidents or heads of state, 4 prime ministers, guerrilla and peaceful leaders in Kosovo and Albania, and civil society or local experts who have written on political science. And what I found is that in the case of Kosovo, Albania after communism had no coherent policy on external kin in general. In terms of factors that affected it was, first, there was very low domestic pressure. The Albanian, I mean, the push from below was almost zero. Most people concerned about ending communism, misery, and Albanian isolationism during communism, and didn't so much care about the call for a divided nations or uniting or helping. There were very high constraints from EU and NATO membership, as there was a growing elite consensus to Europeanize after failing to socialize in socialism. So there was it, and there was, in terms of dealing with the kin, there was assertive and resourceful kin with pacifist and militant wings. So in Kosovo we have, towards the end of the brink of dissolution of Yugoslavia, we have a very big civil resistance movement organized around Democratic League of Kosovo, which in 8 months in 1989 achieved 700,000 members of a population less than 2 million in Kosovo, which was autonomous region. And then little by little we have also militant groups taking over and trying to pose a kind of challenge to the civic or more peaceful resistant groups. And in this case, Albania initially offered a lot of support diplomatically to the Kosovo. It also recognized a parallel referendum organized in 1991 in September, and was the only country in the world which recognized Kosovo as a republic. However, in terms of real practical support, it didn't offer much, and soon after growing international criticism, it started to consider Kosovo as a minority rights issue, and there were, for a while, even arrests of potential guerrilla leaders in Albania, arguably through the NATO pressure to kind of curb any militant activity in Albanian territory. And I found out, for example, that this was also internalized by elites from Kosovo. For example, one of the key leaders of LDK says that by 1994 it was clear to us that Albania had neither interest nor the power to provide much help as a mother state, as a kin state. Or later on, that showed again that this kind of ambiguity of kin state was internalized by the elites outside. The KLA never requested any permission to use the territory of Albania because we had a sense of entitlement over Albania's territory, but we did meet state leaders and ask for their help. We could not even imagine a situation where we had to come into conflict with the other state, but we were going forward with or without Albania to wage a war on Serbia. And in Macedonia we have a different type of and less conflict and less involvement. But what I found in Macedonia as well, by meeting all potential players from peaceful and armed movement, is that even there, Albania as a kin state after communism did not have a policy what to do with trans-border Albanians in Macedonia. The domestic pressure to do something was very little. It was not a competitive cleavage or political issue. The external conditions were almost the same. And it was not always responding to kin grievances. For example, a number of people that I met, they said that over the 1991-2001 period, Albania was having very good relationships with Macedonia, when we wanted actually to Macedonia to be criticized by Albania for discriminating and kind of exclusionary policies in education and other areas. But after, in 2001, a previously unknown group called National Liberation Army starts an 8 months long insurgency there, and Albania is kind of, for the first time, faced with the realities on the ground. So what I found there is that first, Albania had very little information about the rise of the insurgency, and second is that what happened was that the remnants of the Kosovo Liberation Army were dissatisfied with the NATO intervention and the placement of Kosovo under United Nations administration, started to move the conflict to Macedonia, and key members of Kosovo Liberation Army actually became National Liberation Army, either political strategists or soldiers, and so they drove the conflict, and Albania, in this case, even more distanced itself from any kind of help. So worked with NATO to end the conflict and is one of the countries that was the first to support the agreement reached between the Albanian and Macedonian political force. And even here, one of the key, for example, former ministers of Albania said that we are actually ashamed to see these Albanian guerrilla movements popping up like mushrooms after the Kosovo conflict. They put us in a very difficult situation because we had spent a lot of diplomatic capital to dispel the misconception about Albanian terrorists and Greater Albania, and here they came again to fight for pan-Albanian ideas. So what I find different from the literature, what I bring out with this empirical case is by seeing the state as a key generator, a key protagonist of this kind of kin nationalism, in the case of Albania, we miss the assertiveness and the resourcefulness of the kin itself, of the population abroad. Or in the, for example, in the Irish context, we miss the agency of nationalist or militant movements like IRA or Sinn Féin, or who continue to use identity politics and talk on behalf of the nation, even though they are small, militant, and most of the time even condemned. So this is where I found, in the kind of tracing the process and critical juncture point, is that what actually happened in this case is that there is a divergence of competing visions between the state-based elites of Albania and those abroad. And while Albania prioritized Europeanization and state and economic prosperity, the kin state abroad prioritized one, ending the so-called or perceived discrimination and domination, and a redefinition of cultural borders of the nation, to unite with Albania, seeing it as the only way after the dissolution of Yugoslavia. And this is captured with one very long citation, sorry about it, but it's from one of the leading exponents of the Kosovo movement, who says that for us it became clear that Albania was a kind of inactive, disinterested, and weak. So first of all, we prioritized peaceful over militant nationalism. Second, we did not see only Tirana as a center of help. And third, it helped us to distance ourselves also from Tirana sometimes, to have our own views from the capital of Albania. And as a conclusion, I'd like to say that first, assuming that kin states have a policy or are always doing something about the population outside is wrong. First, looking at this cooperation of kin and kin state as a group that has some kind of coherent, cohesive strategy and are trying to push the national borders in a concerted effort also is wrong. There is more than not only internal but intra-Albania or intra-national competition going on in nationalist movement, and both cases show that in the independent role of the kin in the triadic nexus that I just mentioned, that not only has it grievances, but it has its own type of nationalist politics. And finally, I think which is important to theorize further and see other cases which may be similar, like Nagorno-Karabakh in Azerbaijan, or other cases that they kind of, there are some states or nations which I think it's not unique for Albania, where the presence of large, resourceful kin groups outside makes the kind of nationalism or identity politics a polycentric movement. That it's not always state-driven, less so state-controlled. Therefore, this is one case. There could be more where actually kin is very important to shaping the responses of the kin state, the more established elites. And I mean, I have to cut it here because I probably have gone a little bit more than the time, and there's much more to say about it, but I hope I have given you a gist of what the research is about and some of the findings. Thank you.
My name is Valia Theofilopoulou, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Sociology. I'm in the second year of my studies at the moment. I have been told previously that I speak very quickly when under stress and not very clearly, so if you allow me to read through my notes a little bit, that'll be great. Before I start talking about the theme of self-sacrifice and how it features in the modern Greek literature canon, I find it useful that I spend a couple of minutes talking about the history of the notion of Greece as a modern construct, and not so modern construct in actual effect, in order to emphasize the underpinning assumptions and myths that constitute what we call, think, and for some feel as Greekness. So the roots of Greek nationalization are to be found in mid-18th century European Romanticism, and in a way in Europe's existential anxiety and thirst to prove and establish its ideological supremacy against what was perceived to be an inferior and barbaric Orient, by rediscovering and reappropriating the myth of a superior civilization, that of classical Greece. This idea of rejuvenating the archaic idea, which translated into awakening, the national awakening of what we know now as Greece, was transplanted into the Greek territory by a Greek-speaking intellectual and merchant elite diaspora, which for political and economic reasons liked to see the territory integrating into the Western modernization project. The territory, as we can see in the map here, was at the time part of the Ottoman Empire. It was called, and it's part of that Romania that you see on the map, was a multilingual and multicultural terrain organized in terms of religious affiliation. So, for example, in the Orthodox millet, we see Greek-speaking population cohabiting harmoniously with Albanians, Slavs, Romanians, and Bulgarians, and coming together due to their religious affiliation and orthodoxy. These particular millets, these administrative units, were, yes, they were paying tribute to the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, but they were almost exclusively supervised by the Orthodox Church. And the War Revolution in 1821 finally led to the establishment of the Greek state in 1829. However, the fabrication of the national narrative was not crystallized until a few decades later, when the history of the nation was officially documented and disseminated, whereby one claimed a 3,000-year racial, linguistic, and cultural continuity, beginning from ancient Greece all the way to modern Greece. Itromilidis in 1998 says that this particular historiography depicted the survival and continuous existence of the exceptional historical actor, the Greek ethnos, as an immutable and timeless social organism. Now, the substantial role that literature has played, and I would argue continues to play, in cultivating public national sentiment is something that needs not to be taken in light consideration. Writing from Paris in 1888, Greek philologist Ioannis Mulcahy expressed that a nation, in order to become a nation, needs two things. First, to establish its territory, its borders, but also to the mental and aesthetic project, that is to extend its boundaries and to create its own literature. In his work on Greek Romanticism, Tristanis discusses that the significant role poetry played in Greek culture and the emergence of the Greek state, and during a long period of liberating works across the country, when thousands of copies of poetic collections were widely sold on a regular basis. The literary revival of Romanticism mirrored the romantic desire for a unified Greek nation built upon robust archaic columns, while aligned with the greater European modernization project. This aesthetic invention of modern Greece, at times jubilant, but at other times in poetic manner and melancholic, amalgamated valiant victory with suffering loss, rejoiced the love for an ancestral land. So material and imaginary space blended beautifully in verses that sang about belonging. This creative spiritual turn, however, was modified by the end of the 19th century to allow for orthodoxy to play an equal role in literally constituting Greekness. Now, the role of the literary canon as a collection of texts recounting the story of the nation facilitates the experience of solidarity by allowing people to see themselves as citizens of a unified nation. An analysis of a canon is necessarily historical, and it examines how these texts are used as they were put in specific institutional sites, such as the educational system, the asylum, the newspapers, libraries, etc. In my project, I look at the literature educational canon since 1930. That is, I look closely at the contents of the anthologies that form the primary, if not exclusive, teaching material for teaching modern Greek literature in schools. And it is important to note, in this particular case, that non-Greek literature is only marginally, if at all, taught in Greek schools, and only very recently. This way I want to see how literature is put into use, that is how it is used by the state in order to disseminate this national culture, but by moving them closer to the text, to the prose and poetry that feature in these anthologies, I'm also looking to examine the content of them. So I wish to explore the affective effect, talking about the sociology of emotions here, of these literary texts. So turning now to the self-sacrifice and how the particular theme is features in the Greek anthologies that are taught in schools since 1930, or even prior to it. I'm also looking at the emotive energy that these texts are saturated with. Most of these works cited refer either to the war against the Ottoman Turks in the War of Liberation in 1821, the Germans against the Germans in the Second World War, or against the military junta, interestingly enough, and rather subversively, when the youth uprised against it in the Polytechnic in 1973. Now, my exploration showed that the theme features repetitively in secondary school in at least 3 different ways. In the beautification of militarism and the exaltation of the hyper-masculine, a celebration of martyrdom with death promising emancipation, and a tragic closure that heralds a fresh beginning. The metaphors, simulations, and syntactic playing are all taken into consideration, what Julia Kristeva calls the musicality of language, which managed to escape ordinary significations of life and death. Death for a nation is depicted as duty, wish, and glory. On one hand, elation for the Greek soldier, who dies a perfect death at the altar of motherland. On the other, delight for the Greek civilians that defy fear. Death is seen as a utopia, felt, seen, and read as a utopia, a continuation and blossoming of the national and as such of the self. Or in the latter case, as necessary painful separation with sacrifice giving way to a fresh beginning. So beauty and sin in the hyper-masculine. What unfolds in these verses is a romanticized version of death, that through the sanctification of the bodies of the Greek young men fuse togetherness with duty and a life beyond. Sense and ethos blend, with mortality naturally turning into immortality. Omnipotent men equipped with the power to win death, to resist their own existence for an idea. The continuation of an ordinary life is despised in narrations that see further from the one and the present and towards an infinite we. The instinct for life itself is absent, as the reader is lured by the beautified naturalization of heroic acts that disregard the mundane. The self-sacrifice of the immaculate fighter is productive in reflecting and securing the exceptionalism of Greekness, enduring the pressures of ideality and perfection that seductively welcome the national icon that saves from the real. The sounds of emancipation, talking about the celebration of martyrdom with death promising emancipation. Past, present, and future aesthetically coalesce to construct and sustain a national memory that is filled with confrontational encounters with the enemy. Death is felt as the effective resistance to a life in servitude, as a collective reaction against the condition of being excluded from free life. Self-sovereignty blends with national resistance. Solidarity in death, promising self-emancipation. Enemies adumbrated as terrible tyrants and beasts against which the Greeks tried to gain mastery through a liberating, self-inflicted death. A feeling of freedom enjoyed in the perishing for the nation, nourishing the national imagination. And finally, and as I said before, subversively quite, this particular type of prose and poetry referred to the youth uprising in 1973 against the military junta, which took place from 1967 until 1974, but it has been officially added to the national narrations of the state, or by the state. This time the literary depictions break the perfection typically reflected in acts of self-sacrifice, so instead of beautiful or energized portrayals of bodies marching together towards infinity, the reader now is prompted to feel the heaviness of a tragedy. The representation of this sacrifice is not about harmonious homogeneity against external threats, nor is it about the firm demarcation between the we and inimical others. Actually, the other being with a capital O, refers to an organic failure of we. Instead of glamorizing the nation, these verses mourn for what the nation has turned into, showing that the national dream is inherently vulnerable, and it's upon the youth to stand against this corruption. And I'd like to finish now by saying that by drawing at the thresholds between life and death, as aesthetically sued, institutionally reiterated, and effectively met in the Greek school literary canons, as death for the nation becomes, continues, or recreates life, one sees motive power's penetrability, effectively shaping at the limits of life. And I'd like to thank you.
Actually, you might notice that I changed a bit the title of this, and the reason is I looked at the program and I realized that I'll be speaking in front of a quite different audience that I'm normally used to. So I want to actually just engage a bit more with the city. What is the connection with the city and the nation? And so we're just going to talk just a bit about my PhD, then a bit about thoughts about how can we look at this interrelation between city, urbanism, and nationalism. So my PhD is about urban reconstruction. And urban reconstruction normally is studied as a form of political economy. This is in most of the social sciences, or it's studied in architecture and urban studies as what about the form of reconstruction. But I'm not interested in this because we have the famous example of Warsaw, in which by rebuilding in the same form of that the city looked before the destruction by the Nazis in the Second World War, the Polish post-war government wanted to build the nation and wanted to legitimize itself. It was a socialist government. It might seem strange that they will use this kind of architecture, but the idea was that by going to victimhood and martyrdom as essential tropes of Polish national identity, they will actually gain a form of legitimization. However, if you look at the example of the case of Germany, the country that inflicted the destruction of Warsaw, you had similar destroyed landscapes. Basically, all the cities, with the exception of one, that were 100,000 more, were bombed by the Allies. And then how is it to deal with this landscape, especially since there are some people who started saying to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. And my question was, what about architecture? Can we just rebuild as nothing has happened? Can we actually just think about the functionality and the housing and infrastructure and shelter as an expression of reconstruction? Or is it something more? So by using Adorno, I'm talking in my PhD about how do architects, especially, but city makers as a whole, deal with coming terms with the past. And how does that contribute to reconfiguration national identities? So this is the overall framework of my research. But today, I want to do something else. Just to discuss a bit the relationship between the city and the nation. So in fact, in my PhD, I discuss a number of situations, of urban situations in which local populations generally perceive themselves as victims, but there are also accusations of those societies as being perpetrators, and then a differentiation between external and internal sources of aggression. But I'm not going to dwell upon this. What I want to discuss a bit is how the relationship between the city and the nation, from the city being representational of the nation to being an ambivalent relationship, and then to this concept of herbicide, which some of you might be familiar with, and then just some brief conclusions from my research about reconstruction as an urban process, and then how that goes to affirmation of national identity or ambiguity. So maybe the simplest way to look at cities and the nation is capital cities. And there's a lot of research on capital cities, on symbolism. And if I will introduce the two cities that I'll derive my examples mostly today, Belgrade and Sarajevo. If you look at, you have exemplary architecture through the nation building period that symbolizes institutions, the state, but also the nation. However, in many times it's more about state building than nation building. Because if you look, for instance, similar architecture and urban experiments happen in New Belgrade after the Second World War, in which you cannot, is that nation building? Is it more a case of a state building? And you have emblematic and speaking architecture that will show the state in its desire to control territory. And then if you look today, so this is not over, this is not something of the 19th century as it usually happened in European capitals. We have the famous or infamous Skopje 2014, in which the city is being remade in order to show the glory of the nation. It's nation building as we know it today. But cities are not only representative of the nation, sometimes they're antagonistic to the nation. And it's very interesting to look at there's research on perception in the former Yugoslavia. For instance, you have Belgrade. Belgrade was attacked in 1999 by NATO as being the seat of power of Milosevic. However, if you look at the city level, and this is what I want to argue today, that you have to look also at the urban level, not only at the national level, you see that there are different dynamics happening there. Because the population there, a majority was opposing the regime, and was accused by some commentators as being the whore of the nation. because there you have a conglomerate of people coming from various republics, or even if they're Serbs, they actually they deny their national identity. Momo Kappa was a famous writer originally from Bosnia, but then moved to Belgrade. He was saying that the capital should be moved because Belgrade is really it's treacherous. It's not really representative of the nation. So the city is antagonistic to the nation. And then you have the even more known example in the relationship of city and nation to the city of Sarajevo. And you see here the architecture that you see from towering minarets to a Catholic neo-Gothic cathedral to an Orthodox church represents what Sarajevo was imagined, was understood as a Jerusalem of the West, as a cosmopolitan, as having all these forms of pluralist religion, and there's a particular theory and understanding of what happened in the siege of Sarajevo as being actually, this is the alternative, let's say, to, or maybe complementary to the nationalist explanation, that in fact it's not only that it was surrounded in this case by parameters of Bosnian Serb origin, but in fact they were rural, and they have this explanation that like the city was targeted because the city meant urbanity, mixity, pluralism. It's not because inside during the siege there are many Serbs who remained during the siege as well here. So this triggered Bogdan Bogdanovic, who was the mayor of Belgrade in the 1980s, to write at the beginning of the 90s that what we assist is an attack to the city, and this is herbicide. So cities are in fact, cities are killed, are targeted because they are cities, because they are plural by the nationalist monolithic understanding of the world. And the emblematic building of this concept of herbicide is the Vijećnica, which is a city hall and then National Library. I'm sorry, vice versa. In Sarajevo, which was targeted. These people who write about herbicide, they say it was targeted because of a symbol of culture, of urbanity. You had all these documents which show also the history of common living, and it was targeted exactly to deny this history. So this is a particular explanation. I'm very curious to see how you react to this, because it's about cities being targets, not nations being targets. So it's this herbicide, or some would say cultural herbicide, but it's herbicide. And then how do you deal with Reconstruction? And this is where my work actually goes into. So if you go back to Sarajevo, what's important for the ones who don't know the situation today is that you have the capital of the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina. There are two entities, the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina and then Republika Srpska, and Sarajevo is not, the majority of the city is in the Federation, but there's a small part which is in Republika Srpska. And basically Reconstruction will happen in these two ways, and in these two parts. And I'm not going to talk about the process itself, but just to highlight a number of things. The nation in this place is expressed after the war, particularly in a connection with religious identity. People speak, despite people speak a language that's intelligible to all. So the way that they articulate this difference and identity, and especially elites articulate that, is through helping particular religious landscapes taking over. So you have a proliferation of mosque building. Then on the other side in Istočna Sarajevo you have entire urban schemes surrounded on reconstructed churches or new churches. But more recently, in the last 5 years, you have also Franciscan Catholic churches, because the small number of Croats living in Sarajevo also want to have a spatial expression of their presence. And what's interesting here, I want to bring this is a concept of intentional architecture. Normally, sacred objects or any form of reconstructions you can call them, they're somehow functional. They are catering to the needs. And you can say that after the wars, people need, let's say, to express spirituality, and that's why there's a proliferation of religious buildings. But then he will argue, no, it's intentional architecture. So, and if we go a bit further by using Johan Galtung's cultural violence, and then Bourdieu's and Žižek's symbolic and structural violence, we can go into this violent nature of Reconstruction. In fact, Reconstruction, by bringing brings nation building and also brings a form of structural violence, and Valia also did that in the north of Spain. But I think it's very interesting after the Civil War. It's interesting to look at this context as well. While places of common memory, which is, for instance, a partisan memorial complex on the hills of Sarajevo, they're not reconstructed. They're not taken care of. They're not because this is not part of this nation building, separated elite and then political and local administration discourse. I wonder how I'm doing with time, because
3 minutes.
Okay, then maybe I'll just skip very quickly. This nation building is actually enforced by international capital, which might seem strange. So political economy and then geopolitical influences are also interesting. You have a lot of mosque building done by the Saudis. You have Turkey, very influential. I'm not going to discuss this. And this idea of the bridge and of strengthening the Bosnian national identity through this connection with Turkey. Then you have on the other side schools that are simply called Serbia, and it's in Bali. But I want to move to just briefly discuss the case in Belgrade of the Generalstab. This is a very important building in territorial sense because it's right in the middle of one circulated boulevard, essentially with another. And the debates about the reconstruction of this building, which for 15 years and more remained in this state, trigger the question why? What does it have to say? Is it the lack of money? Is it bureaucracy? And if, I interviewed different levels of local authorities who will explain and give all these bureaucratic explanations that these buildings are not reconstructed. But then I interviewed architects and because my focus is to understand how city makers, authorities, but also architects deal with the ruins and with this concept of the nation. And architects have different perspectives. For the sake of time, I'll just consider a couple. First, these should not even be rebuilt. This should be a memorial, a ruin, because NATO bombed the city. This is right there in the center. It's a memorial because everybody is reminded by this. It's strengthening the idea of victimhood, which is an essential trope of Serbian national identity, as some people have written, but it's also arguable. But then you have very few others who actually say, okay, but these ruins, in fact, what they show is the whole complex of events of happening in the 90s. And after all, this is again the general staff of the army, so it's not. It did have some connections to everything that happened there, and so it is that simple. This is the end of that era, and this is violent that era. We have to preserve them for this sake. But this idea of ruins are maybe not kept there because of bureaucratic problems, maybe because of the lack of architectural vision, but it's also a theory which Philippe Eydous has talked about, ontological security. The state doesn't actually know what to do with this building. Right now, it's somehow an informal monument of victimhood, or strengthening national identity. On the other hand, what is going to be rebuilt in? The Emirates, a sheikh from the Emirates has expressed interest to make a hotel, but it's this hesitation in dealing with ruins and making a lucrative, pragmatic, or memorial interpretation of ruins, which actually shows the whole ambivalence and ambiguity of memory politics, but also of directions and sense of national identity in this case. So just in a nutshell, kind of how looking at certain urban sites, you can see all the tensions and ambiguities of national identity and nation building. And of course, and I will end just saying that it's very important that after seeing the builders of the nation, from the authorities to, let's say, the architects who are very underlooked, but in fact, space does matter, it's very important to look at the bottom-up perspective. And I will end it here by saying that what about the relationship of urban populations with all these processes and how they relate to the shifting landscapes and reappropriations of space, and also international capital coming and claiming certain things. So I'll leave it there. I hope there will be some questions to discuss this, and I hope cities will also ignite some of your interest. So thank you very much.
Okay, so good afternoon. So, like I said, my name is Nolan, and I'm currently a master's student here at UCD studying sociology. So as part of that, I had to do a dissertation, so I decided to do my dissertation on Scottish identity, particularly the Scottish referendum. So I decided to have a look at the role of the media in building identity during the Scottish referendum. So of course I adopted Michael Billig's banal nationalism as a key text to look at how identity is portrayed through words and linguistic devices to reproduce national identity. So I'll just start by talking about the referendum then. So the referendum was held on the 18th of September 2014, and it was for Scottish voters, and 4.3 million Scottish people voted in the referendum, which was 83.7% of the voting electorate. So 53% voted no to stay in the Union with Britain, and for the first time it included 16 and 17-year-old voters. It's been heralded as one of the biggest democratic turnouts in contemporary British politics. So, like I said, I was concentrating on the role of the media, and in particular Scottish newspapers, during the coverage of the referendum. So I adopted the methodology of critical discourse analysis, particularly using the framework laid out by Wodak in her chapter, Discourse, Analytical and Social Linguistic Approaches to the Study of Nationalism, which is in the book Nations and Nationalism, the Sage Handbook of Nations and Nationalism. So I picked a period between the 1st and the 18th of September 2014. It was the last stretch of the campaign. Now I picked them dates for a couple of reasons. Mainly during the summer it was a combination of the World Cup, the Commonwealth Games and Wimbledon, meant that kind of the referendum was kind of pushed down a bit in the referendum in the newspaper coverage, because everyone likes the sport. So I picked the kind of the last stretch of the campaign as well, because you could say some argued that the No campaign, Labour and so, didn't really kind of kick into gear until the last maybe week or 2 weeks of the campaign as well. So I decided I'd pick that sample for the most rich data. Okay. So to pick my sample, I used three categories of the Scottish press outlined in Law's article, Near and Far, Denial of National Identity in the Scottish Press. Now he conducted a survey of the Scottish press in 2001, and he concluded there's three types of categories that can describe the political alignments and arrangements of the Scottish press. So he labelled an Indigenous category, which was very Scottish-centred, would point to the Scottish nation and reinforce Scottish identity. The Interloper, which would often in the same line would both reference the Scottish identity and kind of British identity. So it would kind of, like I say, Interloper, it would kind of flip and flop between the two identities. And then Anglo-centric, which is very, very British or more English kind of centred based. So like I said, I picked the Daily Record from the Indigenous category, which you see in the highlighted, the Scottish Express from the Interloper, and the Guardian newspaper from the Anglo-centric category. So, a couple of kind of preliminary kind of findings or notes that I think I should cover today. First off, the three newspapers I covered, they were all heavily biased towards the No campaign and unionism. All three newspapers were all very supportive of the No campaign and very negative towards the yes, the independence vote. So then I've outlined kind of three titles that I'm going to quickly breeze through, and then I'll show you an example. So number one is the constriction of our patriotism. Number two, the nationalist threat, and three, the objectivity of the Guardian newspaper. So the first kind of linguistic kind of strategy that I found in the data analysis was this thing that is called our patriotism or their nationalism. Billig outlined in his book Banal Nationalism a kind of a distinction that can happen where nation nationalisms tend to project all the negative aspects of kind of nationalism as being nationalism, while saying that we are patriotism, we have all the good kind of civic, helpful aspects of nationalism. So in the newspapers I found this particularly so in the Scottish Express and the Daily Record. Data use words such as we and our to construct in-groups, national in-groups, associated especially with the No campaign identity, which is kind of a unionist, kind of British kind of identity. The identity called upon the kind of the Scottish people in terms of reference of staying within the union between Britain. And it was constructed as being above and belong the realms of nationalism. And nationalism was reserved for the Yes campaign solely, and the No campaign would say, we're not nationalists, we're just patriotic. We're emotional for our country, but these nationalists, they are irrational, they're emotional, they're erratic. So I'm going to show you a brief extract here now from a Scottish Express article So in the article, the author is he's talking about a meeting, a speech with Gordon Brown and Alice Darn. They met a number of union supporters in Glasgow, Maryhill Community Hall in Glasgow, on the 17th of September, the day before the referendum. Now, as you see in the extract, I've highlighted, underlined a couple of sentences. So Mr. Brown told them to hold their head high and be confident, and in a patriotic appeal he said, "What we created together, let no nationalist split asunder. And tell them that our patriotic vision is bigger than nationalism, and we want Scotland not leaving the UK, but leading the UK." So there's a number of kind of devices that are happening here. Like I said, there's the author uses, and Gordon Brown says, "What we created together," and he uses "our" and "us" to build a kind of sense of national belonging and national kind of, reproducting, a kind of sense of community and belonging to a sense of identity. But then he distinguishes this identity from what he claims is nationalism by saying, "Our patriotic vision is bigger than nationalism, and let no nationalists split asunder." So he's labelling the Yes campaign simply as just the nationalists, not even saying it's the Yes campaign, as if reserving nationalism for the Yes campaign and reserving kind of patriotism and, our kind of rational, we're, all the good aspects of nationalism as patriotism. So, now the second kind of linguistic device that I found in the data analysis, again it occurred mostly in the Scottish Express and the Daily Record, was what it calls a perpetuation strategy of nationalism discourse. So this was it's discourse that creates an identity which is perceived to be under threat. Now, in the context of the study, it was that it was construction of independence, and the nationalists and the Yes campaign were constructed as a threat to the status quo in Scotland, the stability of Scotland, and particularly the economic stability of Scotland. So, as I previously said, the Yes campaign were branded as emotional maniacs who were willing to throw away everything for aggressive and emotional motives. Whereas the No campaign adopted the kind of the mantle of kind of common sense and a kind of risk assessors, using their heads rather than their hearts, stay in the union because it's a sensible thing to do, it maintains the status quo. So I've got another extract here from the Daily Record. Now, here the author, we see that he highlights, he says, a number of risks attached to abandoning all benefits deriving from our membership of the Union with the UK. Now, the author goes on to say, according to Alex Salmon, we're not supposed to mention these things, he says it's negative, but then he goes, "I wonder if he was taught at school, look before you leap, or look both ways before crossing the road. Every child knows these are not negative, these are a means of minimising risk. It's called risk assessment." So here the author is comparing the No campaign as, as risk assessors, thinking in their head, a means of minimising risk. It's kind of a common sense, thinking clearly, whereas the Yes campaign, just kind of walking out into the middle of the road, not paying attention, not, using their heads, so to speak. So then finally, another kind of finding that I came across in the data analysis was the Guardian coverage. Now, the coverage of the Guardian didn't distinct such a big differentiation between the Yes and the No campaign. They didn't have such a big distinction between the patriotism of the No campaign and the nationalism of the Yes campaign. Instead, they had a large sense of kind of detachment from the whole affair completely. The coverage of the referendum was treated almost as if it was from afar. They were observers, not partaking in the referendum at all, simply just sat there watching it. But, of course, the Guardian is distributed throughout Scotland. Scotland did have a say in the referendum. So, well, why is this the case? Why are they seeing? Well, like I say, the Guardian is Anglo-centric, and it adopts the view of the English observer, not the British or the Scottish participant. So we can see this in the next extract. So the inability of the No campaign to articulate a coherent, passionate and convincing case for the existence of the United Kingdom seems from the outside quite staggering. The pleasure of witnessing this democracy in action is tempered by a nagging question, why is it not like this all the time? What really matters now is whether the Scots return, like the rest of us, to a state of frustrated powerlessness. So, from the outset we can see that he actually says from the outside, so that kind of implies that it's been observing and the pleasure of witnessing. And witnessing again is not partaking. Rather than saying partaking, witnessing is you watching something rather than partaking in the democracy. And he finishes off saying, like the rest of us, meaning in reference to the English observer. And the Guardian was taking a view of the English observer rather than the British or the Scottish participant. Okay, so just a few concluding remarks. I think hopefully I've shown a few of the linguistic devices used in the coverage of the referendum. However, I think it's important to note, although the referendum campaign has been over for a number of months, I don't think this issue is going away anytime soon. As we saw in the general election a few months ago, the rise of the SNP taking 56 out of the 59 available seats in Parliament in Scotland, coupled with the referendum for the UK membership of the EU, I think this all points towards that this issues of Scotland within the Union and Britain is going to be a big issue in British politics to come. Okay, thank you.
Could I invite the four speakers perhaps to sit up here, if you don't mind being in the spotlight again, and if you have any questions then. Or standing over there is good too. Dave.
Okay, so I have three questions. The first question is for Roland. I was wondering, in the triadic nexus that you discussed, does the institutional background, that is the autonomy or not having autonomy or any kind of arrangement, does that play any role in kin state policies towards that king? Also, a small correction, you mentioned in policies of expulsion to Turkey from 1948 till 1968 or something like that. This policy started much earlier during the kingdom with the treaties between these, which is quite interesting that the communist state continues with the same policies that were agreed in the previous period. Then I have a question for the Sarajevo and the Belgrade thing. And this is, you also mentioned in external influences on nation building, on architecture and this sort of things. And you showed a very interesting example of the city hall in Sarajevo, which was built by Austro-Hungarian architects in a Moorish style. You know, there was an assumption that since there is a Muslim population, we should build things in a Moorish style, which has no historical references to Bosnia or to the Ottoman Empire in that part of the world. But I was wondering how important that period is, and how is this appropriated in nation building project later on. And just the last question for the last presentation on Scotland, very interesting, and I think you really point out correctly the strategies of these two different camps, one kind of branding the others as nationalists, although both of them are nationalists in their respects. And I was just wondering of the choice of the newspapers. Wouldn't Herald, for example, in the kind of Scottish camp, would correspond much more to the Guardian in terms of the audience it addresses and you know, the type of newspaper it is? Thank you.
Okay, folks, we'll begin.
Thanks for the question. I think with regard to the correction, I have no disagreement, but my point was to say what the communist kin state policies look like in addition to their period of time. So I didn't cover interwar period, but the kind of forced or expulsion or registration as Turks started during the interwar period and was a little bit carried out until Rankovic. But with regard to the first question, I think what I found during the discussions with key players both in Kosovo-Albanian diaspora and leaders in Albania and Kosovo is that there was certainly some kind of bifurcation in terms of prevailing views of what to do with the autonomy. How good autonomy was for Kosovo. And what was interesting is that Albanian diplomats and the intelligence service officials that contacted these groups who were kind of mushrooming in the West told them that, look, the best deal for you would be to expand the autonomy and get a republic. If possible, of all Albanians in Yugoslavia, if not convert Kosovo into from an autonomous province into a state of Albanians, with some Albanians left out, of course. But even back then, most of the more left-leaning, of course, who were sympathetic to Albanian dictator, left-leaning groups were also disagreeing with those diplomats of Albania and saying that actually we want to unite, if possible, with Albania. But they were cautiously told that it seems this is too much to ask in communism or whatever happens. So Albania was kind of suggesting or recommending to them to get expensive or advanced status. And this is where I think the diverging or competing visions of what to do with this issue of divided nations on have been carried into the post-communist period, where now it's more liberal and you can talk about these issues, but still Albania was kind of more like logistical nationalism. I'll help you advance, but not necessarily unite or mix the leadership pools. I don't know if it answers.
Well, thank you very much for the question. Actually, indeed, the Vječnica and some other buildings in Sarajevo were in part of this romantic interpretation of the Austro-Hungarians of what is it's very Orientalist in the discourse. Actually, there were Czech architects, most of them, who did it, and coincidentally, this is the style used for synagogues in Hungary. In the idea, oh, they must be we must bring these Oriental motifs in architecture. Going to the present, and how is that used? It's very much appropriate. So that is a symbol of the city. That particular building, there's been many donors and a lot of money put in, and was reopened last year. But I'll give an example of a hotel that's close by to talk about how Habsburg buildings are used for the nation today. The Hotel Europa had two parts. One part was built in the Habsburg times, another one was built during socialist Yugoslavia. And it was destroyed in the war, and now it's rebuilt. Very conservative restoration on the one hand, and the other one is brash contemporary architecture. And I interviewed an architect. I said, "What? So why did you not decide to do everything contemporary? Or why did you choose that?" And he said, "Because Habsburg, that is Bosnia. That is Bosnian architecture. While Yugoslavia was just a parenthesis in our history." So it's interesting that, so in his discourse, and this is an architect who's doing most of the work now for being filmed in the city. But this is an understanding that modernism and things built in socialism are parentheses. However, Habsburg is a part of the city identity, and it's part of the national identity.
All right. So with regards to the choice of newspapers, I went off a couple of factors. First off was readership figures. Now, the Daily Record is the highest indigenous Scottish newspaper. That's why I picked that. Scottish Express then was the second highest in the category of interloper. But see, then I was trying to look at all three kind of perspectives of the Scottish media. You see, I thought the Scottish kind of elements were very covered in the Daily Record and the Scottish Express. That was what I was expecting. So I wanted a kind of a more kind of unionist kind of more British-based aspect in the Guardian. As it turns out, they all happen to be quite, not what I was expecting. But that's the reason why I chose the Guardian anyway.
I have a question. If we can ask questions now.
You'll have the last question. How's that? Okay. Diane and Saoirse.
So I have a question for our Greek colleague. When I look at, or when I think about Irish relations between church and state, I suppose for most of the 20th century we would think that relationship is very close. And when we look at various cultural events, for example, the publication of books or the experience of writers in Irish literature, it's been a rather unhappy experience for some, where they felt they haven't been able to progress in their writing and their career living in Ireland, but have had to emigrate outside of Ireland in order to write and to progress their literature in the way they saw fit. So you talked a lot about the importance of the use of literature in building the Greek nation and the sense of identity in Greece. And I didn't hear so much about the role of the Orthodox Church in that story. I think you mentioned it a little bit, but much as the Catholic Church is paramount in our experience in Ireland in terms of our sense of identity for most of the 20th century and on in, I would argue, for the 21st century, where is the role of Orthodoxy in Greek identity in your story?
Could we just get the other questions?
Oh yeah, I have two actually, one for Valia and one for Gruia. I was wondering, how does that injection of self-sacrifice, as a virtue, how does that translate into everyday life in the Greek population?
Everyday life.
Yeah, if children are being brought up as, the great virtue is self-sacrifice for the good of the nation, I wonder how it pans out. And then, as regards the ruins in rebuilding, I'm thinking Warsaw quickly rebuilt, Belgrade left this kind of iconic ruin. And I was wondering, does that say as much about their relationship with the perpetrator as it does about their own, for instance, Ground Zero in New York, rebuilding that was kind of a statement that you won't get a better one. Is it saying something about their relationship with the perpetrator?
Yes, talks to the third speaker as well. I was just wondering, your focus is on two capital cities, which are largely mono-ethnic, as a consequence of all sorts of things and wars. So in that respect, there is a room for ambiguity, kind of you talked about. But what about cities like Mostar, which is deeply divided, and I visited Mostar recently, and everything is divided. You have to call an emergency service. If you're a Croat, you call this number. If you're a Bosnian Muslim, you call the number, and so on and so forth. But what struck me in a way, because I've been to Mostar before the war, and it was really very diverse, and you couldn't see that. Obviously, there was an architectural power of the communist state present and visible. But now you see this war of symbols. You have the mosques, new mosques were built, and then you have the cross on top of the mount, and then constantly, building new symbols to fight. So there's no ambiguity. In a sense, there is this constant war of symbols, architectural symbols. So how would that fit into your analysis?
I think we have a very quick question here.
A very short question about the Greek literature. I was wondering if you also looked at the teacher manuals, because sometimes, we have the history textbooks that definitely have the victim, the resurrection of the nation, and so on. But too many people study history textbooks. It's actually really refreshing to see literature. But the manual that usually comes with it will tell the teacher, read this piece of poetry and highlight to students, I don't know, the feeling of Greek nationness or whatever. So what is the explicit, not just the implicit in the literature, but the explicit instructions that come with it? I was wondering if you looked at it.
Well, are you going to get it, Eva?
Oh,
well, you were going to get the very last one, okay? Yeah.
Okay, to the first lady who talked about the Greek orthodoxy, maybe I didn't emphasize it enough in this particular presentation, that absolutely, because I was more probably prone to emphasize the archaic ideal and the myth of the archaic ideal behind the modern Greek, modern Greekness, as I said. But absolutely, the Greek Church plays a substantial role in establishing Greekness and in infusing Greekness on a day-to-day basis, and even through literature. So the literature educational canon, the most famous, let's say, poets and writers are fusing this archaic ideal with Christianity, with orthodoxy in their poetry, and this is what makes Greekness today. This sort of antagonistic and at the same time complex and interesting fusion of something very modern, which is the rejuvenation of the archaic ideal into modern identity, together with something which is a pre-modern or not modern, which is Christian orthodoxy, and that is definitely what constitutes Greekness today, and it's definitely very prominent in Greek literature and the Greek literature canon even today. Yeah, I'm going to answer your question now. I am looking at the manuals as well, and I'm actually at the second phase of my PhD project, whereby I'm interviewing teachers and of elementary schools and also philologists in the secondary school, and which bring forwards very much so the explicit nature of creating and establishing a national identity in schools. So yes, during the last few years, the teachers and the philologists have been left a bit free with regards to making sure that we do infuse this particular identity in the schools. But due to the fact that the literature canon is based on poetry and prose, that is national, in a sense, they can't really escape from it. And that's exactly what's coming out from the interviews. When it comes to the manuals and let's say the analytical programs that say exactly what the teachers should be teaching in schools, it's again implicitly said that it's important that the Greek students know exactly what's happening with regards to their past. This particular past is that myth that I was talking about. Your question is the most difficult to answer, I have to say. Because it will probably be an opinion more so than something that I have actually researched to a great extent. So what I have to say is that in a more theoretical way or in a more literary way, yes, sacrifice is always there on a day-to-day basis, even in rhetoric, in newspapers, everywhere. Sacrifice is a theme. Now, whether we as Greeks, or they, the students, or the youth, are actually feeling that they should sacrifice for their nation is something that needs to be discovered in a rather different way than what I'm doing at the moment. So it's either a very long conversation that we can have, or I pretty much have to stop it here in the sense that I actually don't know if every single, or if Greekness in itself today has this feeling of, yes, we are going to sacrifice for our nation.
Okay.
Sounds like we're for lunchtime. Okay.
Yeah, so I was saying that Reconstruction, maybe because of the 2 hours of sleep it didn't come across, can connect with nation building as affirmation or ambiguity. And the example of Sarajevo with those sacred buildings, I was trying to say is affirmation because it's divided. It's what you were talking about Mostar. That's actually at a hyperbolic stage with the tower of the Catholic Cathedral being 3 times as large as it was before. So that's a form of affirmation to Reconstruction. In the case of Belgrade, I was talking about ambiguity, and that connects also with your question. First of all, you asked about who are the perpetrators. In that case, there's so many debates about who the perpetrators were. And if I could just give you the example of another ruin, the radio television of Serbia, in which 16 people were caught in the ruins when NATO bombed. Later, the families found out that, in fact, NATO informed the government that they're going to bomb, and the director, with the instruction of the regime, made radna obaveza, which means that they kept people, they had to work that night in order to create human victims. And the families, and this is one of the cases of my PhD, is actually how to memorialize those ruins. And the families in the last 10 years have aimed to rebuild that ruin as a memorial and looking at this process of rebuilding. And in this case, who did it? And members of one particular woman says, I blame NATO, but I blame the regime for what they did in the region, and I blame the regime for making my son work that night, because they wanted a human victim. So it's more complicated. This is why it becomes ambiguous.
Thank you.
Yeah. Did you want to respond to Senesh's comment about the...
Yeah, I started with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I understand you may have a question yourself.
No, that was a very tiny thing, but I just wanted to ask why, for the last paper, why is the Guardian the English observer? You said it is English observer and not the British participant. When looking at the Guardian as a whole, why is it not the outsider? Just an outsider, not necessarily in English. Where is the Englishness in the Guardian?
See, because
compared to other dailies based in London, they have quite an internationalist tone, and I wonder why would you qualify them as the English observer, not the outsider observer of scholars?
Yeah, obviously I didn't go into too much detail in that because it was covering the referendum, you know, and it was, you know, a British, you know, a moment of British history that can influence English, you know, as well as the Scottish. But like I said, the English didn't have the ability to vote in the referendum. Therefore, they were looking upon the Scottish nation. So the Guardian kind of adopted that kind of view of watching from an English perspective of what's happening in Scotland, you know, kind of a step back, as I say. But like I said, it would also reinforce, you know, national boundaries and national identity at the same time. So it's not exactly like, you know, an outside, you know, nation, you know, like France looking in, you know, at, for instance, the Irish referendum that's happened here recently, because there still is a connection to what will happen in the referendum, if you get me. You know, there was still an impact, but it was almost as if they were powerless of what was going to happen, if you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah, the Guardian had explicit also policy, or they expressed that, I think just the day before the referendum, they said that they are against Scottish independence, so they took active.
Yeah, they were,
because normally they have a very international design. That's why I was curious why you call them as English.
Yeah, it's like I said, it was still against independence, Scottish independence. But like I said, it was voicing his opinion, but almost like I say, as if the English people were voicing an opinion about the referendum because they had no say in it, but it still would affect them directly. Yeah.
Thank you.
Folks, can I thank the participants for wide-ranging and interesting papers, and to you for your interest and questions, and in the time-honored tradition of clapping our hands. Can we